Feeling ready? Great. Who's this group that you said hello to? Okay, good evening. Good evening, Ms. Llewell. Thank you. Good evening. I'm Brendan Boyle. I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs, and I very warmly welcome all of you to this, the fourth lecture in the Graduate Institute's summer lecture series, Liberal Education in the Age of the LLM. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, please permit me a couple of brief announcements. Next week will be the last lecture in the series. That will be given by Annapolis tutor Hallie Barnett, 7:30 here in the Great Hall. Mr. Barnett's lecture is titled Thinking Machines. The following Wednesday, I believe that's July 30, we will have an all-college seminar to which you are, of course, warmly invited. Information about the reading has been distributed, and it will be made available in the dean's office in the days ahead. One more quick announcement. I've been remiss in the first 4 evenings in not welcoming those who are joining the lecture online. That's primarily our low residency students, and I'm very grateful that they're here. I suspect that many of our Santa Fe colleagues tonight are also watching online. You're most warmly welcomed, and we're delighted to have you here. Let me now turn to tonight's speaker, Santa Fe tutor, Mr. David McDonald. I know it's not customary to introduce our colleagues, but I do feel as if I owe a debt of gratitude to David, and I want to make that clear. First, I want to thank him for all of the imaginative thinking that he did while director of the Graduate Institute. That imaginative thinking has certainly inspired me to compare great things with small, and I'm grateful to him for thinking capaciously and imaginatively about what the Graduate Institute could be at St. John's College. Second, I'd like to thank him for his particular thinking about the place of technology in liberal education. As many of you know, I'm myself quite interested in that question, but David was onto it many, many, many years ago, offering preceptorials on Heidegger and Borgman, well before the idea that there might be a place in the Graduate Institute for something like the study of technology and computation was ever conceived. So I think David really prepared the way for me and certainly many others to think about the place of technology and computation in liberal education more generally. And finally, I thank David for showing and embodying the conviction that the college should be and must be a central part in conversations, contemporary conversations about technology. I think David has lived that conviction and done his best to make it clear that he thinks that the college really is the place where conversations of this sort should and must take place. So for those three reasons, I want to extend my great gratitude to David for coming here. It's a very short temporally trip, but long in miles trip, and I'm especially grateful that he's made it. I know that we'll learn an awful lot from him tonight, and I most warmly welcome him to the podium to deliver a lecture titled Attention and Being, Thinking About Electronic Media. David McDonald, please.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction. Sip of water. My lecture this evening originates in this question. If love is attention, as Simone Weil says, then what does it mean that we are paying so much attention to our phones? What are we loving, if anything, in attending to our phones? My curiosity began here. More largely, I undertake the project in part to reflect on media and on mediation, which I take to be the essence of modern technology. While on the one hand, mediation seems to make many activities easier and offers the prospect of ease, on the other hand, it makes beings less present to us in their unassimilable majesty. Here we have both the appeal and the problem of technology. I would like to reflect also on the relation of liberal education to this problem, keeping in mind the claim, a true one I think, that keeping mediation to a minimum is a slogan I might use in beginning to articulate the ethos of this college. In the latter part of my lecture, I'll say a few things about how we could treat technology as a topic or concern here. As for our use of technology, it says enough that our classroom is furnished with tools of learning recognizable to most anyone 100 years ago. We have only a table, a blackboard, chairs, books, and ourselves. There are no laptops and no cell phones. So let's pick up with the originating question. To do that, we'll need to have some way of thinking about what attention is. Weil tells us how it shows up as a disposition towards one's neighbor, but does not directly provide, as it were, a metaphysics of attention. For reasons which I hope will gradually become clear, I want to develop the notion of distance in order to speak properly of attention. We'll find that a few authors invoke the notion, and distance shows up even in the metaphor of bending through space, embedded in the word attention. In my initial account of distance, I draw heavily on what Walter Benjamin says in his 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, about aura and about distance. He is, among other things, developing an account of the effects of photography and cinema, which he treats more or less as one thing. Also implied in his account are print and audio recording. I take him to be working on modern media, mechanical reproduction, which includes the various means of profuse image making beyond the film photography of his time. For many of us, the most familiar notion in the essay is that of aura. He's thinking about artworks and what's lost when they are reproduced, made into photographic or cinematic images. Quoting him, "What withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art," he says. Aura has to do with the history of the thing, its situation in time and space, its provenance. When the artwork is reproduced, when mass images are made, authenticity is lost. For Benjamin, authenticity is tied up with what he calls the historical testimony, quoting him, all that is transmissible from its beginning. With the loss of aura, quoting again, substantive duration ceases to matter, as Benjamin says. If the general effect of modern technology is to overcome time and space, the crucial loss with respect to the work of art, the man-made thing, is its temporal placement, its peculiar relation to time and its own origins, and its relation to what it's been through. With this loss of authenticity, the object also loses its authority. We could look for examples to make this less abstract. Any number of frequently imaged artworks could serve. Michelangelo's David, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Eiffel Tower. What's the authority of any of these things when you are not there with them? When you are there with them? We can assume seeing them in person will convey something to you. Yet if you do go to see them, that experience is itself so informed by and deformed by their fame through reproduced images that there's a sense of disappointment. Their original authority relied upon an inhabited and dynamic historical continuity which has been lost. As Benjamin says, the uniqueness of a work of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition. What their meaning is now is an open question. There's plenty of fuss about the Mona Lisa, but what does it really signify for most of us? Benjamin anticipates this. He says, by making many reproductions, the technique of reproduction substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence. At the same time, it allows, quoting, the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation. All this together, quoting again, detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition and leads, as he says, to a tremendous shattering of tradition. A few observations here. The Mona Lisa reproduced meets you in your own particular situation. This means you're less obliged to meet it in its situation. That could include seeing it in person, which we've noted is an experience already colored by the many images you've seen, not to mention the huge ahistorical crowd surrounding it. You might never bother to go if indeed you feel you already have a sense of what it is. Regardless, you are unlikely to meet it in its situation, partly because that situation has been lost for you, partly because its authority has dissipated. The visit to the artwork itself becomes something like a tribute to the old authority, an affectionate and aspirational nostalgia for uniqueness. The artwork is mediated by the images you've seen, by the sense you already have of it. It has already been assimilated to you and will have limited power to arrest your attention and call you out of yourself. That ability or power would be its authority, now diminished through reproduction. In our education here, we encounter such authority in the texts we read. At the same time, we rely on the technology, on the mass medium of printing. You might think that the ubiquity of editions of Homer's Odyssey would diminish its authority for us, its ability to call us out. Yet, in general, it retains its authority, even in translation. That may be because texts have a different mode of being and different basis for authority than do paintings, sculptures, buildings, and so on. I began with aura because so much what Benjamin says about aura will apply intriguingly to distance, and because these two are largely the same. As he puts it, the concept of aura, which was proposed above with reference to historical objects, may usefully be illustrated with reference to the aura of natural ones. He's speaking no longer of the things we make, artworks and artificial things, but now of natural things. He says, we define the aura of the latter, of the natural object, as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. And here's the pivotal description from Benjamin. If while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon, or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains, of that branch. The experience isn't quite the same as with the artwork. Authenticity, for example, isn't a question, or not in the same way. Tradition and historical testimony are not important here. Authority is the uniting factor in the work of art and the work of nature, the natural being. It is what the Kestrel possesses in Iris Murdoch's essay, The Sovereignty of Good Over Other Concepts. She calls it beauty. Beauty and the authority of being are two descriptors for the same experiential domain. And I refer to the Iris Murdoch essay in part because we had just read it at Santa Fe a few weeks prior to the lecture, so it was something that the whole college had read in all college seminar. Murdoch speaks about the experience of beauty as perhaps the most accessible and obvious way for us to undergo what she calls unselfing. Such unselfing, in her account, helps with goodness. We need to be drawn out of ourselves in order to be good. We need a change of consciousness. Beauty, or what I've called the authority of being, can provide the occasion. And quoting Murdoch now, I am looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious of my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige. Then suddenly I observe a hovering kestrel. In a moment, everything is altered. The brooding self with its hurt vanity has disappeared. There is nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important. This is a practical Platonism. An encounter with beauty can bring us toward the good. It is also an instance of an encounter with a natural being, what Benjamin calls the unique phenomenon of a distance. Returning to Benjamin's branch, The branch in particular is a charmingly peculiar object to choose. The mountain on its own would be a more glamorous and conventional example, yet he mentions the branch which casts a shadow over you and not just the mountain. This shows that distance is a homely business. First of all, as he says, it's not simply a matter of remoteness in space. The branch might be materially quite close, yet it retains distance. Second, it's very ordinary, and it's merely the sort of thing continually burgeoning forth among natural beings. The authoritative thing is not far to seek. And yet, as homely as it is, it has something in common with the work of art. This is its singularity despite being like other branches, its unassimilable quality, its standing as a thing. Its aura is its unique phenomenon of a distance, as he has said. What he will go on to say helps make the meaning more clear. He says that the decay of the aura has two social bases, two drivers in the societal sphere. Namely, as he puts it, the desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer spatially and humanly, which is just as ardent as their bent toward overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. Every day, the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction. He's right to describe it as ardent. It has a strange eagerness, as if motivated by some background love or ardor. I will try later to sketch out what this love is, which would assimilate to us all things. For now, we can say that while the spatial distance of the branch or the mountain or the kestrel may vary, the reproduction is indeed close to us, held close to us. The reproduction overcomes distance, what you could call the metaphysical distance, and also overcomes the more literal distance. Both sorts of distance, metaphysical and material, are what a medium such as photography or cinema reduces, even to the point of abolishing it. Here I want to make a brief excursion toward Marshall McLuhan's assertions about media. He famously says the medium is the message, and that particular claim was so often repeated in McLuhan's day of fame that some of its force may be lost on us now. What it amounts to is that the crucial thing communicated by a particular medium is its overall teaching or habituation, what it actually enforces or promotes through its use. As he puts it, the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. So these media of reproduction, photography and cinema to start with, and electronic media now, which subsume photography and cinema, inasmuch as they bring things closer, have a message which stands over and is more consequential than the ostensible content or message of any one instance of media transmission. You can infer the message through the effects. The message is that everything can and should be brought closer, that uniqueness is to be overcome, that everything is to be held close. Another way to put this message is that everything can be assimilated to me and can be brought into accord with my own desires. This is a psychology, an ethics, and a vision of the human person, that the unregenerate wishing portion is the true center of the self. It is the practical and effectual teaching of modern media. What was present already as a teaching to one degree or another in print, photography, cinema, and audio recording has been combined more powerfully in the medium of networked computers. As McLuhan says, each new medium incorporates the prior ones and makes them mere content. So you might say to yourself, I'm just watching a movie on my phone. And such content of a medium, that movie, as he says, and this is quoting him, is like that juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. You are captivated by the ostensible content of the short video you're watching. Meanwhile, you are being robbed at the level of the medium. In any case, the message of the internet, and which it delivers in a more trenchant, encompassing, and irresistible way than did any of its now swallowed-up forerunners, is that it's all about you. and that everything can and should be called up to order in whatever way you wish. There's a prescient quote from Paul Valery, which Benjamin includes. So this is at the beginning of his essay, if I recall. Valery says, "Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign." Generative AI is the next media form in this succession. The distinction and independence of the thing not me continues to be under attack in more and more totalizing ways. We are becoming strangers to branches, mountains, kestrels, and to being itself. This is through the loss of their unmediated authority. The costs of this for our ability to thrive are extreme, as I shall try to spell out later. Let's return to the idea of metaphysical distance. Benjamin has broached it in relation to what we would call the things of nature. Murdoch also starts here with her account of the kestrel. As she says, we take a self-forgetful pleasure in the sheer, alien, pointless, independent existence of animals, birds, stones, and trees. The way that natural beings don't simply accede to our purposes, this really matters, and it's an aspect of their independent existence. For us, they are pointless in that they don't fit into our own selfish purposes, though they may well have a point of their own, or a whole set of veiled purposes, which are theirs and not ours. They have their own being, which stands in refreshing distinction and contrast to our own. As Murdoch argues, we can be ethically invigorated through our apprehension of natural beings, and this comes from at least momentarily forgetting ourselves, our purposes, our wishes, and resentments. To forget oneself in this way is quite different from, and is at an opposite extreme from, ordering up words, images, and experiences to suit our moods and wishes. In any case, Benjamin and Murdoch both seem to be working out an understanding of distance, of the proper distinction between self and world, and the proper authority of beings. Without distance, world is not present. When distance is abolished, there is only the self. The tale of Narcissus may help to show an undistanced relation and why it's not enough for us. As Ovid tells the story, the beautiful youth Narcissus is plagued by reflection. First, the nymph Echo, in love with him but incapable of any utterance truly her own, gives him back only his own speech, and that in pieces. She is the ostensible other, but reflects him to himself. She is not in any way accessible to him as an independent being. She can only reflect. She cannot provide to him anything that he himself hasn't already given. She is only echoing him. And to take the figurative reading quite far, echo is the instigating algorithmic medium. Ultimately, she becomes a voice without a body. The lack of a body I take to be an emblem of her lack of being or lack of availability as a being. For him, she is essentially a mirror. Now Narcissus encounters his own image in an exceptionally clear and mirror-like pool of water and takes the image for real as he drops down for a drink. And now I'm reading from a translation of the Metamorphoses. While he drinks, he is seized by the vision of his reflected form. He loves a bodiless dream. He thinks that to be a body, that is only a shadow. He is astonished by himself and hangs there motionless with a fixed expression, like a statue carved from Parian marble. Unknowingly, he desires himself. He will go on to become increasingly agitated at his inability to touch or embrace what he sees. It has no body, where again I take body to stand for being, for something with independent authority. What he sees lacks being. The representation cannot provide what he yearns for. What he yearns for is the real, is something actually present to him that is not himself. The water, as the perfect medium, gives him only a representation, and that representation, ultimately, is entirely assimilated to himself. There is no distance. In a final desperation, he wishes that the thing he sees were distant from him while simultaneously wishing to forsake his own body. And quoting from the tale again, "My riches make me poor. Oh, I wish I could leave my own body. Strange prayer for a lover. I desire what I love to be distant from me." The image is too close, too much his own, too lacking in the fresh and vigorous difference of reality. So he ends in a repudiation of and alienation from his own being through having been deprived of the experience of the being of another. He does not wish only to encounter himself. Now he expresses the desire to die along with his own reflection. As he speaks his final words, Eco repeats them. The motif of reflection and representation continues. When later a funeral for Narcissus is to be prepared, there is no body to be found. Here we take the body to mean the full presence of being or of a being. And indeed, being for the purposes of this lecture is what we encounter in ordinary life as branches, birds, and corporeal human persons. At the same time, we can see here some premonition of the modern escape from the literal fleshly body when one gazes fully and extendedly into the perfect and ultimate medium. In some extreme of the modern scenario, nothing is left but mediation. Echo and the mirror-like pool have no being of their own, and the being of Narcissus has collapsed through a kind of starvation. He is starved of any encounter with being and loses his own being as a consequence. We can draw from all of this a notion I will present again later. Our own being, both its robust standing and our ability to affirm it and find it good, depends on and is nourished by the encounter with other beings. Maximally mediated visions will not do. Narcissus both dwindles and disavows himself on account of estrangement from the real. Being so beautiful, perhaps in his original condition instantiating a maximal authoritative reality, Narcissus powerfully draws others, but he is unable to apprehend others and is transfixed by representation of himself. Any representation thus lacking in distance is so fitted to one's own desires as to amount to a self-portrait. Thus, a closed system, a feedback loop, is established which impoverishes the viewer. The apparent novelties offered by electronic media are conjured up to suit us. They thus lack the bracing quality of what might genuinely originate from outside the loop of mediated experience, such as the kestrel, apprehended with minimal mediation, or a human person, a true other encountered face to face. Leibniz's idea of infinity in the face of the other helps us here. If you were wondering what's lost through the mediated image, we could say it's every aspect of the human person which exceeds our capacity to have preordained it, to have worked out beforehand in some reductive account of the person. What can be rendered in a picture on my cell phone is by its nature already constrained by the representable. It must necessarily be a reduction. And further, the algorithmic selection of images and my own choice from among those offered by the algorithm is constrained by some set of predeterminations. It's what the machine thinks you like or what you think you like. Meanwhile, the personhood of another exceeds all such notions. On what basis, you might ask? I take the burning bush in the Exodus account as an emblem of personhood. Chiefly divine personhood there, but by extension, all personhood has such uncanny inexhaustibility and exceeds our comprehension. One can look at Augustine's account, too, in his Confessions, to the effect that the human memory is inexpressibly vast and that the human soul is abysmal, of unplumbable depths. But further, you might look to your own experience. Part of the difficulty of dealing with others is precisely the fact that they are wayward, unpredictable, unconformable to our concepts. Ordinary life shows over and over how unencompassed and uncontainable the other can be. And this is part of the impetus for taking refuge in the soothing experience of the phone. It's a balm for when you're tired of the burning, direct incandescence of the human other. Boredom has something to do with this condition, the condition of being surfeited or frightened by being, and seeking as an alternative an undistanced and unchallenging relation. One takes refuge but still craves the adventure not chosen. One notices the lack of liveliness and lack of surprise but still shies away from being. That's an unhappy condition, hence boredom. We can see that boredom may be more likely in a highly mediated age. One can easily turn away from being, and the habits thus formed make one yet more likely to do so. Such turning away from being has its reverse or opposite, the turning toward, and this is attention. Our English word attention enters the language through Chaucer, who carries it over from Latin. Attention goes all the way back to a Latin word meaning to stretch to or to stretch toward. To attend is to stretch towards something, while attention is that act of attending or directional stretching. You can see that there's a spatial metaphor of distance in the word. The sunflower attends on the sun, stretches toward the sun. In order to stretch towards something, there has to be distance to reach into, some distance across which some directional extension is possible. Benjamin's metaphor of distance with reference to the authority of natural beings now coincides with a metaphor of distance carried in the word attention. To turn your attention toward a being means there's enough distance for such a stretching to take place. If there were no distance, which is to say no independence belonging to the being, there would be no possibility of attention. To put it differently, if there is not difference between you and the being you behold, you cannot properly direct yourself to it. Narcissus, then, is not really attending to himself when he looks in the mirror like water. Indeed, it seems a real question whether direct attention to the self is possible. And it seems unlikely that a representation so close in, so assimilated, so much already one's own can be an object of attention. We need some other name for what Narcissus is doing. We shall say that he does not attend to the image, but is occupied with it. His relation to the mirror like water is not one of attention nor of love. But the present meaning of narcissism these days captures something of this configuration. It is being occupied with oneself without any metaphysical distance in the self-relation. Another question which arises here, if we dwell with the metaphorical possibilities, is what it means to be distracted. The first sense you might have just noticing the latent metaphor in the word is a kind of dragging to the side, a dragging away. That's the Latin meaning behind the word distract. So if you imagine attention as being a stretching toward across distance, distraction would be a dragging aside, a diverting of that extension. Hence our words diversion and distraction mean nearly the same thing. If now we examine the experience of distraction, I think we'll see that it's not usually a matter of shifting from one being to another, that is to say, from one authoritative being to another authoritative being. If you are paying attention, let's say, to your child and you are then distracted, it's unlikely that some other being is distracting you with its own vivid presence. It's more likely some representation on your phone, for example, that distracts you. You are shifting from a distanced relation to a relatively undistanced one. Inasmuch as distance has been lost, you have ceased to be attentive and you are now merely occupied. The loss of distance in such an example means that here the metaphorical background of the word distraction is somewhat misleading. Your attention has neither been dragged aside nor shifted the way that a plant's tendril might move toward a new source of light, but has rather collapsed on account of complete proximity. There's no room for the outstretched tendril of attention. Let's sum up what we have so far with regard to attention and carry it a little further. Attention is attention across distance toward the being of another, toward something not me, and not toward a representation generated for my gratification, nor toward myself. Without such distance of difference, there can be no stretching toward, hence no attention. Nor can there be the nourishment, the ratification of my own being, which I would receive through apprehending the being of another. Narcissus abolishes himself on account of being so deprived. He gets plenty of attention but cannot give any, and this saps him of being. And without distance, there cannot be the possibility of surprise, of challenge, or of resistance, all hallmarks of an encounter with the real. It is precisely this resistance, the assertiveness of the real, which might strengthen us, make us more able to affirm our own being, both through our having been challenged and through our having encountered models of sturdy presence. Deprived of such resistance and of models for emulation, our own being becomes insecure and anxious, even self-negating. Hence, continual lack of distance resembles in its effects what we call trauma. Frequent use of electronic media induces something like the condition of having been traumatized. And for those already traumatized, electronic media may compound the condition. I want to state the primary claim again because I think it's likely quite urgent. Excessive mediation resembles trauma in its effects. What we could call trauma psychology becomes very common in a time of high mediation. My recapitulation so far emphasizes the good effects of having access to beings minimally mediated. The ability to attend across distance to the real helps us avoid the fate of Narcissus. But there is also the virtue of attention for the sake of the other. This is the ethical aspect which Murdoch seems to have in mind in her account of the Kestrel. Self-forgetting helps us be less petty, less irritable, and opens us up to the world of beings so that we might be good to them. Through really attending to a present human predicament, one might discern the right way to proceed, and somehow, apart from any rule-based ethics, mere attention to beings might show you what to do. A being's own nature shall instruct you, shall show you what it needs. Are you unsure how to do right by your friend? Pay attention to your friend to start with. Here, there's an incipient ethics of attention. Of course, there's room for doubt about how fully one can develop an ethics of attention, but surely distraction is anti-ethical. I want to interject here a brief note on receiving attention. To receive little attention or unreliable attention or demented attention is the other side of the Narcissus story. This is trauma in its more commonly understood aspect, that a parent, for example, incapacitated in the manner of Narcissus might be unable to attend to you, unable to fulfill a primary ethical obligation. One could tell a story of attention in childhood, a developmental account. This story would have to include, on the one hand, the encounter of the child with the steadiness of being through the parents and a world of other natural beings and of works of art, and then, on the other hand, would include the steady, loving attention paid to the child. Electronic media can interpose in both directions. The device can stand in poorly for the parent, becoming a surrogate parent, or the device can occupy the parent at the expense of the child. This might be another way to speak about the connection of electronic media with trauma, or at least its connection with insecurity, anxiety, and a sense of unreality in the self. My own sense here is that trauma and extreme mediation are at least parallel in their effects. Each is an instance of deprivation, where having been so deprived obstructs the development of authoritative being in the child. Simone Weil, to whom Murdoch owes a great deal, gives us a more directly religious sense of the ethical meaning of attention. So now quoting from Weil, "The love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say to him, 'What are you going through?' It is a recognition that the sufferer exists, not only as a unit in a collection or a specimen from the social category labeled unfortunate, but as a man exactly like us, who was one day stamped with a special mark by affliction. For this reason, it is enough, but it is indispensable to know how to look at him in a certain way. This way of looking at him is, first of all, attentive." Here we see that recognizing the existence of the other is crucial. He cannot be seen as merely an instance of a category. This would amount to his already being encompassed in our thought, or in some shared social currency of representation. One must acknowledge the independent reality of the other before one can love, before one can attend. As Weil says, belief in the existence of other human beings as such is love. And she, like Benjamin, adopts a metaphor of distance when speaking of the separate dignity of those we love. She says, To love purely is to consent to distance. It is to adore the distance between ourselves and that which we love. Once you really believe that the other exists, once you consent to distance, you are able to attend to the other. By the way, this offers a clue about what it could mean to love oneself not in the way of Narcissus. It would need to begin with an acknowledgement and regard of one's own being, whereas Narcissus is infatuated with a bodiless dream, a representational phantasm. All of this is very high-minded. It's easy to moralistically recommend getting face-to-face with being and with reality. Yet in actual practice, we are all to some degree averse to the real. As T.S. Eliot puts it, ventriloquizing in the voice of a bird, "Go, go, go," said the bird. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." I'm not sure how to reconcile that with what the kestrel seems to say. The kestrel seems to say, "Notice me, the authoritative, beautiful being, and you'll do better." This bird of Eliot's has a much different story. It's a more dour and chastising sort of bird. But one way to understand Eliot here is that regardless of our disposition, our capacity is limited. Weil thinks the problem is dispositional. She says, quoting, "Something in our soul has a far more violent repugnance for true attention than the flesh has for bodily fatigue. This something is much more closely connected with evil than is the flesh. This is why every time that we really concentrate our attention, we destroy the evil in ourselves." This would be her account of why we might turn away and not practice attention toward other beings. There is an evil principle at work. For her, the goal is ultimately attention toward God, and this attention is prayer. Thus, it's a project with commanding importance, and she doesn't have much patience with failure. Murdoch, though working in a more atheistic frame, is insistent on our selfishness and our low-down desire to protect ourselves from pain through fantasy and delusion. So she too thinks there's a problem with our disposition. I think the problem is primarily just our plain old finitude with only a tinge of selfishness. So I'm pretty sympathetic myself with our desire to get a break from time to time. So let's suppose we've always had some difficulty with reality, for whatever reason. Most of the time, the burning bush is too much for us. Infinity in the face of the other is too much, and all this has always been so. But let's add to this inborn avoidance some factors of recent origin. One factor is the shattering of tradition, which Benjamin mentions in connection with the loss of aura. Maybe tradition has had a buffering effect, making our encounters with other beings more varied, softened, or somewhat refracted. In traditional ways, decorum or protocol allows at least a ceremony of approach when encountering another being. Further, being part of a convivial local community with established modes of understanding entails some collective adaptation to the difficulties of the real and some sharing of the shocks. With the loss of tradition and the loss of shared frameworks of meaning, our pre-existing and primeval skittishness when it comes to reality is amplified. Technology plays a large part in these amplifying changes, and technology seems to offer some responsive relief. We've already seen that electronic media, though occupying us in ways which can feel relieving, will in general not help us feel better or do better. If we now point out its addictive element, the predicament looks even more severe. It is common to say, and surely true, that we are addicted to our phones. This is more than a mere desire to find from time to time some relief from the real. The device is by design actively cultivating and promoting our captivity and has immense commercial forces behind it. Others make money by entrapping us. In this respect, the device is similar to any addictive substance which can command our physiology and which has a money-making project propelling its distribution. The addictive power is the same between old drugs and new devices in that the irresistible leverage shows up at a fundamental neurochemical level regardless. Your body-mind wants it. The question then becomes, given the grinding quality of contemporary experience, what non-addictive modes of relief are there? One response is to say more variation in the kinds of beings we encounter and in the modes of encounter could be helpful. One might turn from an intensive social experience to an extended and free apprehension of natural beings. Go see the branches, the birds, the mountain. This would be a shift of attention rather than a move from attention to being merely occupied. In addition, it would seem to be a change to a different mode of attending. We can imagine also modes proper to the activities of sewing a shirt, of playing an instrument, of fixing a fence, of going for a run, or of reading a book. Some rethinking of the place of technology is needed. This is difficult because our minds are already colonized by it, even formed by it. Our domination by technology is a self-reinforcing movement where the effects on community, on culture, and on the day-to-day feel of being human amplify themselves continually and condition our choices with regard to our use of technology. Many of us begin from the condition of being lonely and anxious, a condition arguably worse now than it was for our ancestors, and we make our technological choices from that disadvantaged and hungry position. Meanwhile, the overall sense of inevitability which surrounds technology as a force is strong. Often, the sense of inevitability is paired with an unreflective and unsupportable techno-optimism. We must engage in critique and do so in public. That's a task of ours. The practical side is harder, but as a clue to what practical measures could look like, I want to speak of Odysseus, for he is eminently practical. The ship of Odysseus and his shipmates is being driven by the wind toward the sirens. Each of us, were we to hear the sirens, would hear the song made especially for us, as if by algorithm. Odysseus will hear a song flattering to himself and exquisitely attractive to him. He will hear exactly what he most wants to hear. But his shipmates, his friends, lash him to the mast. Without his shipmates binding him to the mast of the ship, he would be destroyed through the power of the song. This is an image of how the moderating, stabilizing, and even limiting role of a community makes us less susceptible to the power of the sirens, the algorithmic voices which would transfix us and would lead us into greater and greater isolation. Most of us, I expect, know someone who has been driven mad by the internet. The unceasing song has drawn them into some idiosyncratic and isolated frame of mind, paranoid, fearful, detached from the ways of knowing proper to embodied experience. In general, electronic media have led us to a crisis of practical epistemology, where the ways we might know together have been overcome by the ways we might seem to know in our solitary chambers. Odysseus' story points to the way that a community of localized friendship might tether each of us and help us remain in touch with basic ways of knowing, grounded in and informed by encounters with reality. This can be very hard to accomplish since old-school sociality is besieged in every way. We would need to look at many things, not just our use of cell phones, but our use of automobiles, a close cousin of electronic media. Automobiles have affected how our dwellings are designed, where they are placed, how we use our streets, how our cities are laid out. This is just one side, the aspect of physical infrastructure and its effects on our ability to be together. And we would need to look more radically at our ethos of social atomization and how we got here. It's worth putting forward some picture of what community might be for, as difficult as it may be to bring about, and the Odysseus story shows such a picture. I began with the question of what it means if attention is love for us to pay so much attention to our phones. What I would conclude here is that we are not paying attention to our phones, we're only being occupied by them. This is because there is not sufficient distance for attention. With distance, there is respect for the authority and stature of the thing that is not me. The most important among natural beings for our thriving is the human person. And other natural beings matter too. The tonic for our present difficulty, at least in part, is for us to deliberately minimize mediation and cultivate susceptibility to encounters with kestrels, human persons, branches, and with books. Books, I said earlier, have an authority largely unimpeded by mechanical reproduction, and they bring us to the real in a peculiarly effectual way. They bring us not just to their own reality as mysterious, unnatural beings, but to the reality of whole realms otherwise unreachable and full of creatures of great beauty and sovereign dignity. We open the book and peer into a vast, teeming garden, open another and find within it a different and equally coherent ecology of being, and so on with the next book and the next. It would be worthwhile to develop an account of why books at their best operate so differently with regard to the real than do electronic media. And lurking here, of course, is the question of just what I mean by the real. The topic of books being really the central medium for our community, gives the occasion for me to turn briefly to the question of how liberal education ought to engage with technology as a concern. Tonight I've spoken mostly about electronic media, but electronic media can stand for modern technology as such, since I have claimed that mediation is the essence of modern technology. This claim is a recasting of Albert Borgmann's claim that the device paradigm is the essence of modern technology. We, as members of a community of liberal learning concerned with cultivating freedom, might start by asking which modes of freedom with respect to technology ought to be cultivated or preserved. And I think it's good to think in specific terms. So I'm going to enumerate 3 freedoms that I think are what matter here. These are ways of being free with respect to technology. The first freedom is a freedom of critique and circumspection. This entails having an account, a critical distance, and some mobility of mind with respect to technology. This freedom often manifests in what we like to call thoughtfulness at the college, a reflective habit of mind, a mental independence which can take up nearly any human concern in a disinterested way. Here, disinterested is a term of praise. One puts aside personal gratification and personal advantage for the sake of seeing the thing as it is to whatever extent possible. At the same time, the best thoughtfulness takes heed of the stakes. Seriousness always entails that something be at stake. So this first freedom is a freedom of mind unencumbered by strictly personal interest, while having a sense of ethical consequences. It is the ability to think self-transcendingly, while still being alert to the moral and ethical meanings in one's thinking, which is to say, it's a nuanced and humane transcendence. Nuanced and humane transcendence. The second freedom is a freedom having to do with adventure and demystification. It is, I believe, at the heart of our laboratory curriculum at St. John's College. This is the freedom of an educated layperson to take on and try to understand technically challenging material. Each of us should, in principle, be able to pick up a scientific paper, work through it, and have reached some understanding. In the same spirit, we wish to minimize opacity. When we do lab work, we want our instruments to be as simple as possible. No black boxes, no accessory gadgets whose own workings are a mystery to us as we try to come to terms with the primary phenomena. We wish to minimize mediation, to encounter the things themselves and to think about them. We take delight in understanding and regard it as a proper human activity, and we seek fidelity of understanding. So this second freedom is that thing we see at St. John's of being undaunted by hard things and wanting to learn them even though they're hard or possibly because they present such a challenge. So that's the second freedom. And that's a freedom we could exercise with respect to technology, is to read hard papers, foundational papers, try to understand the fundamentals of computation and so on. The third freedom is a practical and experiential freedom. This is the freedom I imagine Murdoch has in her encounter with the Kestrel. It is the freedom to be moved instructively by beings. It is the ethical agility and openness entailed by Weil's question to one's neighbor, what are you going through? It is the ontological astonishment at the basis of philosophy and at the basis of what Weil would call love. My sense is that ontology and ethics merge here. Liberal education cultivates this freedom through bringing the learner into contact with the real over and over with minimal mediation. It even cultivates a love of the real, for the contrary would be captivity and delusion. This is a crucial freedom to cultivate in spite of technology which continuously offers increased mediation. So those are 3 freedoms that I think one could have with respect to technology. Having sketched out those freedoms in what is just a first articulation, I want to talk through what seem to me the primary pedagogical approaches. While those freedoms would be the aims, or at least the guiding ideals for liberal education, the pedagogical approaches are to do with how things can play out in education generally, and not just in liberal education. So now I'm going to enumerate several pedagogical approaches, and they can blend with one another. They don't exclude one another. The first pedagogy requires that we know just enough of the technical matters to keep us honest. For example, it's good to have learned something about how AI, large language models, work, or what a universal Turing machine is, because having some understanding of these things matters for being able to think well about technology. But then the larger project here, so really the key of the first pedagogical approach, is having assumed an honest tethering to technological facts, to recur to the literary, philosophical, and religious texts which can ground the claim of human dignity. Or we would recur to those texts, at least, which can spur thinking about the most fundamental problems as we live them out in particular conditions, in these present conditions, for example. From a full anthropology, that is, a rich account of the human person, and from a developed sensibility, we would seek what it means to live well, and would address technological questions from that standpoint. We would learn from accounts which try to come to terms with technology as a philosophical, religious, or humane problem, and we would work on accounts of our own. So that's the first pedagogy. That's what I would call the humane approach. The second pedagogy pursues the intrinsic satisfaction and the proper human fulfillments which go along with understanding. All men by nature desire to know, as Aristotle says. Let there be no gatekeepers. We ought to learn whatever is learnable in every domain, and ought to venture into every important realm of intellectual endeavor. We shall not be intimidated by tough technical papers, and the technocratic edifice ought to be just as amenable to inquiry as any other. We shall not simply defer to those who know, but shall seek to know for ourselves. Great foundational work has been done in computing by Shannon, Turing, von Neumann, and others. There's much to learn here, and we ought to give it the old college try, just as we do in other areas. The third pedagogy asserts that there's nothing new under the sun. There is not much to think with respect to technology that has not already been thought. We are and always have been technological beings, makers and users of tools. Techne itself is well characterized by the ancients and early moderns, and it would be a dull, merely sociological or psychological project to give an account of the meaning of modern technology in daily life. And the gadgetry, the technical side, is no more important than the workings of an automobile engine. We succumb too much to contemporary spirit if we make technology a topic, when there is so much of great depth and importance to think about already. There are many gaudy and unworthy elements in contemporary life, and this is one of them. We ought to put such aside in favor of better things. That's the third. The fourth is techno-triumphalism, or at least a quickness to adopt new tools and make them central to the process of education itself. Education in this view does not examine questions of ends, but takes as given the ends which industry provides or which are conventional. While some teachers may nurture private misgivings, the more general movement is toward accommodating technological developments in the name of workforce readiness, or some sense that technology has its own grand necessity for which we are only the instruments. Progress is the watchword here. One version of this view amounts to saying the culture is doing whatever it's doing and education is obliged to follow. That's a brief overview of what I take to be the primary positions on pedagogy. Some of them reflect where the college may stand. The first two do in some mixture, and maybe there's sometimes a tincture of the third. So that would be the humane approach, number one, the pursuit of knowledge approach, number two, and the nothing new under the sun approach, number three, that third one appearing only in trace amounts. The fourth, the techno-triumphalist approach, doesn't guide our work in the St. John's classroom as far as I can tell. The question then is, how ought we to proceed? I will be interested to hear from you about this in the question period. I will say just a little bit here, starting with remarks about the three freedoms. The first freedom, freedom of critique and circumspection, is always vulnerable to being crowded out by the second approach, because it's so gratifying to work on and to succeed with the technical understanding. On the other hand, the first freedom is constantly at risk of becoming merely polemical or denunciatory when left to itself. The second freedom, the pursuit of understanding for its own sake, cannot stand on its own. That is, without some reflective work in keeping with the first freedom, the pursuit of technical knowledge becomes a self-contained exercise in the bad sense. The third freedom is my favorite. the freedom of ontological astonishment. Deep down, I think that love, in Weil's sense, might be the highest aim of liberal education. The ability to encounter other beings with the distance proper to them is the most indispensable trait of a free person, and both ethical and intellectual life follow from this. Now going back to the pedagogies, pedagogically I suppose I'm a pluralist, but I would exclude the last one as inadmissible, the techno-triumphal one, which simply endorses what may be an inhumane movement in the world. And I suppose I would rank them, if they had to be ranked, with exactly the numbering I have offered here. Humane first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Let's stand up, stretch our legs a little bit, and then we'll adjourn to the question period in McDowell 14 in 5 to 7 minutes.